ideas.
All right.
Takes 2 years.
Well, thank you for joining one more completely non-controversial session here at NACW. And if nothing else, we hope that we entertain you and that you in turn entertain us with some great questions. Ensuring the integrity of natural climate solutions. The very sentence kind of evokes like, well, when did you stop beating your spouse? But that's on the negative side. And on the positive side, we are all here because we want to do something powerful and positive to address climate change. That said, we all know how extraordinarily impactful and powerful working with nature can be, or that it can be in the other direction in terms of providing credible solutions. And sometimes things don't go exactly as planned, and sometimes, rarely, things weren't actually planned all that well in the field in which we are. So in order for us to create the compelling case for credibility for natural climate solutions, integrity is, of course, vital. It's vital for the climate. It's vital for consumer confidence that builds the market, and that's your positive giving circle that we all want to encourage. However, if you look at the controversy about natural climate solutions, we may not have been as successful as we would like to be in assuring people that that's the case. So today we have a really terrific panel to address some key questions here. I mean, I think we're all fairly familiar with the questions of standardization, of baselines, of monitoring, of equivalencies between different programs. And we want to answer the question, when is a ton, is a ton, is a ton, and how do you know that? So here we have a consumer, somebody who purchases a lot of offsets. We have a verifier, somebody who knows the ins and outs of every system that is there. And we have a very keen observer of carbon markets and how they impact climate action overall. I have asked each of them to address fundamentally 4 questions, and we're going to walk in order through our panelists for that. And those questions are, what are the most common concerns or issues on integrity that they encounter in the course of doing their business? How is that impacting the market? What are the solutions that they are using to address that? What more needs to be done? And is there a need for further government guidance to provide consumer and climate confidence, or do we have it covered? So going down the panel, they're each going to speak for roughly 5 minutes. We'll have some discussion, and then we'll open it up for Q&A therein. Ariel, to my left here, has a very small job for a very small company, and does a terrific job at that, but I think is going to share some interesting observations for all of us to take note of, and hopefully provoke some good thinking on that. Christian knows every single solid certification system and knows the ins and outs of that, so he's going to give us his perspectives on that from that angle. And Eric, many of you know, is a very calm and thoughtful observer with completely unprovocative assessments of things. So with that, let me turn over to you, Ariel, and ask you to kick us off.
Great. Hi, everyone. Ariel Hayward. Nice to meet you all in this forum. So my role at Microsoft is on our CDR procurement team, our carbon dioxide procurement team. What that means, just context for anyone unfamiliar, we've got 3 sets of goals. We have our in-year neutrality program, so we're purchasing removals to help us cover our scopes 1, 2, and 3.6. Every year now, between now and 2030. In 2030, we move into our negativity goals, so covering all of our operations, operational emissions. So that goal gets a lot larger, and then by 2050, we've committed to remove all of the emissions that we've emitted as a corporation since our founding in 1975. So myself and my colleagues on the CDR procurement team, which now we are fortunate to have upwards of 14 of us total, so very large team, diverse backgrounds. Our job is to go find and help develop new carbon removal projects and find the best that exists out there. The context that I'll be bringing to this conversation is how do we do that in practice? What do we look for? And these questions in particular, I think I can provide a bit of a lens of how we assess projects, whether they exist today or how we help kind of co-develop them into the future with an eye towards our quality criteria and what we need in order to say yes to a project and how we get there. So I will kind of pause on that. If there's more context, happy to answer any Microsoft-specific questions here or after the panel. And what I'm really looking for kind of out of NACW in general is to hear from all of you, the practitioners in the space, how can we be helping projects advance? How can we be helping standards kind of get to clarity on what we're looking for? How can we use kind of our checkbook to help really bring action into the space in the way that we all believe we need to? So if you have ideas on that, I'm all ears. So to the questions, I think, where are we seeing kind of the primary, I'll call them pain points, or things that we need to make sure that we're interrogating with all of our procurement? Specifically within the nature-based space, which is where I'll stay for now, we also procure engineered, but we'll stick to nature-based for this panel. We're seeing quantification questions. How do we think about baselines? How do we think about leakage? How do we think about the emergence of, I'll say DMRV, but I think as most of us know, that encompasses a whole lot of different approaches, right? So DMRV broadly, how do we incorporate those into existing methodologies? How do we go even further than what methodologies currently require to understand specific project context, right? We need to know not only is the project adhering to the methodology, but where do we think it should go beyond and where might it go beyond today? So that's one kind of big area of inquiry that we really look at as we're evaluating projects. The second is, I'll say broadly, local context. How is this project engaging local communities? How is this project ensuring that the project design is such that these quantification credit attributes that we talk about, or especially around permanence, for example, we're assuring those through project design and incorporating local communities and ensuring that their involvement is sustainable in nature over time. They're involved from the initiation of the project all the way through to, they're employed by the project going forward. We're creating a stickiness of these projects within local communities and contexts. That local context also covers things like, how is this country thinking about Article 6 and their NDCs, and how might we consider that as a buyer looking to take long-term positions in these projects? What are some of the risks that we might run into with host country authorization, and how do we contract around those? So that's local context. The third and final piece that I'll speak about broadly is market scaffolding. So where does the current market scaffolding, not just registry scaffolding, but also financial scaffolding, so things like risk mitigation and really clear kind of institutional investment in these projects, where does it exist and exist well today, and where can we work with partners across the space to help bolster and build that out further? So things like, what's the kind of classic financial world doing about carbon? How are they thinking about that? How are insurers thinking about carbon? Mm-hmm. How do we think about broadly this concept of risk? Because there's, I think, and this will get a bit more into how we think about solving these things, but we think that there are elements of risk that we're going to be able to quantify, deeply understand through our very, very intense diligence process, which I'm happy to get into more detail if helpful. We're going to surface those things. We're going to understand where the risks are. And then the question of management, we sometimes will manage it through contracting it either to us or to a counterparty. And often and increasingly, we're looking for ways to defray that risk more broadly and use kind of the risk scaffolding that we've seen in financial markets for a very long time brought to bear for carbon, right? So we're thinking about things like that. I will pause there because I think I'm just about to 5 minutes, but happy to kind of answer any questions that you all have and really keen to hear from you all.
So I'm going to ask a question before we turn to Christian because it actually is a great transition. To what degree do you feel you can rely upon external verification to answer your questions? Because we do have a robust verifier context, set of systems and providers. Or do you have to do more than rely upon external third-party verification?
Yeah, so I mean, what we do in practice is we do more. Mm-hmm. I think one of the ways that I think about it is, and this is my own personal view on this, is it's incredibly necessary that we have the scaffolding that we have today with regard to verification. and for what we are trying to optimize for, which is bringing really high integrity projects to the market that will not land us in a headline, for example, or that will kind of persist in time, it's not yet sufficient to cover all of the needs that we have. And I think really kind of some of the places that that comes from is the methodologies need to be written in such a way that they encompass a whole lot of different individual project contexts, right? We need to ensure that the methodology is written such that many, many projects can register under that methodology, and each of those projects has its own unique context. When we're looking at a project, we're looking at a project. We're not necessarily looking at a methodology, and so we need to understand that context. And I think the verification to the methodology gets us part of the way there. That's incredibly important. And our diligence process and practice goes beyond that to say, how is the local community engaged? How might we use geospatial imaging to understand what's happening on the ground, right, from a quantification perspective? So we go further than that in practice.
Excellent. Well, with that in mind, Christian.
Hello, everyone. I'll do a quick introduction. My name is Christian Eggleton, and I've been a forester for almost the last decade and a half. I'm a California registered professional forester, and I got my start in consulting forestry and then started doing verification about 10 years ago. As of 3 weeks ago, my wife and I had a consulting company in Nevada County, California, and we've been acquired by Tufsuit America. And I'm now the director of forest carbon verification, so that's big news on our end. And but to that extent, the majority of my experience has been in IFM projects with ACR and the compliance market, over 90% of that, and most of that has been, a dramatic increase in business over the last 5 years or so. So want to address what I believe our role is in the integrity of the credits is, like Ariel mentioned, we're here to evaluate the conformance with methodologies and protocols. We really need to stay unbiased toward the potential quality of the project types. However, my perspective is that means that we're there to, say that a developer has done something correctly in alignment with either the regulations or the requirements of the methodology. And when something comes across our desk and we put our stamp of approval on it, it's really important that we have provided that assurance and the substantiate the quality of the project. So between that and the lessons that we learn along the way, I think that another important role that we have is then to be a liaison between kind of our experience with projects and the registries, and maybe less so with ARB, but to identify some of those loopholes and to continue to develop, to provide input on improvements of those processes. So to speak to some of the major things that we encounter are, that could potentially be concerns are unrealistic baselines. Without a lot of tools in our bucket to be able to say, if they conform to the methodology requirements, but they may be not something that somebody would really do, we don't have a lot of tools to say that that's not a viable project. So I think that our opportunity there is to provide the feedback, as I was saying, to registries to improve those processes.
Well, a quick question for you. Since you do verification under different systems, have you got any thoughts on, shall we say, a crosswalk between those systems? Because there are fairly different methodologies with different desired sets of outcomes, or not desired, but different specified outcomes. What kind of crosswalk so that a consumer who, for example, says, I want to offset all the emissions associated with people coming to my wedding in farthest out of Mongolia? Right.
Yeah, I think, I want to say that when it comes to rigor for verification, I mean, most across the different methodologies and protocols, the rigor is nearly the same. It just comes down to what the specific methodology requires. The crosswalk between the two, I mean, to be really specific, a compliance IFM project has a minimum baseline that it has to be capped at the common practice level. Whereas, say, in other IFM programs, as long as it's proven reasonable, feasible, then it can go as low as you can make it. So, but that's where, some of the differentiation comes in between the removals credit and the, conservation or avoidance credit, or however they're being marketed. And maybe then that kind of segues to a point where, people really need to understand what they're buying. There's not, not all credits are the same. So I think that there's potentially an opportunity for that to be a part of the marketing in making that crosswalk more, putting things more on a level playing field.
All right, so is it let the buyer beware, or is it some other methodology for helping create that? Well, with that, let's go to you, Eric, and ask you to share your perspectives on these questions.
Super, thanks, Laurie. So I'm with the Environmental Defense Fund. I don't want to assume that all of you know what EDF is. We're a global science-based advocacy organization with a commitment to combating climate change. And I'm a forester and forest ecologist, and have been with EDF for 18 years. EDF has been involved with carbon markets since the beginning. We cut our teeth on sulfur dioxide markets back in the 80s. And that for us, caused us to understand that, finding ways for the private sector to invest in environmental improvement was a good way to sort of blow through some of the slowness that sometimes happens with pure regulatory approaches. So we've been advocates of carbon markets for at least 2 decades. Laurie kindly called me an observer. We're observers, but we've also been sort of, in a sense, co-creators of some of the carbon markets that are in place. And so we probably deserve some of the credit and some of the blame for things. And we're currently in the mode of really driving high integrity carbon markets because, our mantra is there's no net zero without nature. There is really actually no way to meet carbon targets without putting nature to work. And so we have to solve this problem one way or the other. We could solve it with public financing, and we work quite a bit on putting public financing to work for climate benefit. There's a lot of that in the U.S. right now because of the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law. And I'm a Californian, and this state has done more than just about any other jurisdiction on earth to invest public resources into climate solutions. And that's essential, but it's actually not adequate. We need private investment. There's no pathway without private investment. And so we're rolling up our sleeves and trying to figure this out, and really look forward to continuing that process. Markets have been under stress of late. There's been a lot of critique. There's been some ups and downs in the sort of demand and the price. Some of that is driven by self-inflicted wounds, but there's a lot of good as well. And so our commitment is to helping to define high integrity and helping the market sort of transition to the next phase where it's a little bit less sort of the Wild West and a little bit more disciplined, a little bit more centered around integrity. So I appreciate what my co-panelists have talked about. A couple of efforts, just as examples. There's many. This field is full of acronyms, and I can't remember what they all stand for, but a couple that are really important that we've been involved with. One is called the TFCI, the Tropical Forest Credit Integrity Guide. It's an effort on the part of civic organizations and NGOs like ourselves to identify what a high integrity tropical credit is. So if you're curious about what EDF believes in terms of tropical forest credits, you can find it in the TFCI guide. Just Google it. Another is the ICVCM, Integrity Council, right, Pedro? for voluntary carbon markets. My colleague Pedro Barada is here and is a part of that effort in a very serious way. Essentially trying to identify from a global perspective what a high integrity credit is. And I think that system is very soon going to be releasing some of its findings, and I think could be a major contributor to some of the solution here. I will say that in terms of like specifics, the system that I'm most familiar with is the California forest carbon market. And full disclosure, I was a part of the panel at the Climate Action Reserve that met maybe 12, 13 years ago to write the standards for the California forest carbon market. And I see at least one other member of that panel here, Connie Best from Pacific Forest Trust, who's Laurie's colleague. There may be others. Andrea Tuttle was the chief of CAL FIRE at the time and helped stimulate that process. So that's a system that has come under some fire of late. It's also a system that has some maturity. It's been adopted for at least a decade. It's had a lot of market activity over the last 5 or 6 years, and it's the one that I follow the most closely. And I think it's a great system, and I think it also could be improved. How many folks in the audience use iPhones? And of you, how many of you have the first generation iPhone with you today? None, probably, right? So products go through a life cycle. They require continuous improvement. And I think this is a time on issues of baseline and permanence and things like that where that's a program that could use a little tuning up. And I think that could happen without any disparagement of the history of the program to date. And so I think we're at a moment where that's appropriate. So let me leave it at that and we'll get into the discussion.
Well, Eric is reminding me that some of us have ancient history since at least one of us in this room wrote the legislation that started this off. And that's
Before
for my
that, right?
sins is
Exactly,
me.
yeah.
And we've come an enormous way. From a conversation where I would give a talk and people would say, "What planet are you from?" to what there are over 1,100 people here at NACA, I believe, at this conference, and it is a really vibrant market. So we have, as one person here said, in this space we need innovation, so you're going to throw 10 ideas at the wall and one of them might succeed, and carbon markets appear to be one that has some success. That said, there were a couple of things here that have been flagged, so I'd love to get your points of view on them. And why don't we start with you, Christian, from the point of view of crosswalking between different methodologies. Is there a role there for either private sector ranking systems or governmental systems that you can have a way that says a ton is a ton is a ton, it has an equivalent impact, kind of on the order of grade A bonds and junk bonds? Where do you see that?
Yeah, I think, there are exhibitors here that are attempting to do that. I think that there's a bit of pitfall if it's not standardized. Or if it's another black box. I think it's a great idea to try to educate the consumer, to try to normalize the credits between each other and understand, so that, have a better explanation to somebody who's interested in buying something and really knowing what they're going to get. From a personal standpoint, when I purchase something online and I see, hey, offset my purchase with a credit, I get really curious. Like, is this really meaningful? Or are they just trying to promote my, more responsible consumerism? So I think that there is a role. I would like to see it from like an objective perspective, something that brings everybody to the table. I have not, and I'm not saying come and rush me at our booth after this. I've not been approached by other companies that are trying to do the ratings. I would be very curious to know what are the factors that they're looking at. Like I mentioned before, I need to remain very unbiased in our verification because we're limited to what the protocols, what the methodologies say. But I also have, I would be curious to see what are those missing elements that we're not assessing, and maybe those need to be put into the methodologies in the future.
And Ariel, let me ask you, you really highlighted some of the issues in particular with procurement of offsets that are not within a compliant system. And do you think that a ranking system can equalize the differences between jurisdictions and approaches?
I think it is an important question for all of us to interrogate for a while longer before we make a decision in any regard. I think the step that we can't skip is bringing to the table all of the information about a project and how one might interpret that. And I think it goes to the point Christian was making around what is the methodology for interpreting the information, let alone gathering all of the information in the first place, right? How do we collect data that will help us understand the project context or a methodological context, a geographic context, different project types? I mean, we invest in everything from nature-based, ARR all the way to direct air capture in our program, very different contexts. And so I think the conversation that needs to first happen is one of understanding and surfacing all of the information before we get to a point of necessarily standardized judgment. Like where is there, I guess the question that I come back to is, where is it right to standardize today versus where should we leave some room for project specificity? Because there's local context, there's project type context, there's quantification context, and the technological solutions for quantification for something like ARR look very different from that of DAC or BECS, right? Those are different. So that's the question I think I would prefer personally that we focus on, and I think our program does focus on, is rather than saying, is this the right way to standardize? I kind of use this analogy of taking everything out of your junk drawer at home in order to organize it. You kind of just take it all out and you have to see what's there before you can put it back in and organize it. And I think that question of what is there, I think that especially within the buyer community, we haven't had yet the Rosetta Stone of sorts to help be able to actually interpret all of that information, right? If you're a buyer who is not fortunate to have a 14-person team, and this is a fraction of your time that you're spending on credits, and you're tasked with reading a 300-page project design doc or monitoring report, but you don't have the codex to figure out how do I interpret that. I think that's the first step, is having kind of a shared understanding and interpretation platform before we necessarily get to the point of pushing towards standardization across all things, right? There's kind of that information proliferation stage.
Well, I might challenge you on that, but I'll save that challenge for later in this. But Eric, I'd like to ask you a question. You flagged the urgency and the scale of the problem that we're addressing. One of the things that many of us hear a lot about is the need for aggregation for small landowners to participate in the carbon market, and to the very valuable role they can play. And at the same time, there's a great deal of effort that goes into a project, and as we know, it often doesn't pencil out for smaller landowners. So there is an aggregation question, and then there's a larger scale question. How do you get to the large scale in that? And so I wonder if you might share some thoughts about that relative to the carbon market.
Yeah, that's a great question, Laurie. There are, in this country, most of the landowners are privately held, and most of them are relatively small. Most of them are family scale ownership. So we hear a lot about sort of the U.S. Forest Service or big timber companies like Weyerhaeuser, Sierra Pacific, but most of the land is actually owned by families, and much of it is in need of attention in order to deliver climate benefit, right? So your question is really important. Laurie, how do we get those folks enrolled in programs, whether they be publicly funded programs or privately funded programs, to improve forest management in ways that deliver climate benefit? I think that's critical. And I think, the carbon markets have sort of moved more in the sort of bigger scale, because that's a way to find economies of scale and lower price per acre. But I think finding those opportunities for small landowners to participate is critical. So one model that we're testing in the tropics is called jurisdictional crediting. Some of you have heard of JRED, Plus. It's basically defining large geographies, typically like a province in a country or a small country, to be the deliverer of the credits. This is a relatively new concept. It's going to hit the marketplace probably in the next year. And the idea is that this jurisdiction can deliver a climate benefit and then transact those credits and distribute the benefits to participants in the pool. And we think that that's a model that's worthy of looking at. In the tropics, it's really important in terms of delivering benefits to indigenous people, indigenous groups that have typically been left out of these sorts of large-scale programs. We've been also asking how that type of a model might work in North America. The politics of the U.S. are such that a large jurisdiction offering credits across a large state or something like that, it might not work, just a distrust of government, for example. But maybe at a smaller scale, a local scale, maybe a county could be thinking about offering some of these credits. So we're actually stimulating, and I want to highlight another colleague who I forgot was a critical part of the California protocol, John Nickerson, who's working with some landowners in Mendocino County here in California to just explore what that might look like. And could a county or a part of a county be a credit offering institution? So it's TBD whether it works or not, but I think it's worth trying. So I think that's one model that we're looking at.
Does anybody in the audience have any questions on these issues? Because that's almost always the very richest part of any panel. So why don't I give a quick survey? I'm not seeing a single hand raised. Okay, that got a few hands. The gentleman in the back on this side, yes. And please speak into the mic, because if you don't speak into the mic, your question will not be recorded and you will not be in the annals of posterity for that question.
Hello. I wanted to get a sense of how ICVCM might be shaping perspectives and whether, when category level labels come out, that's going to actually shape. I guess I'm asking Microsoft, Ariel, this, but I'm curious to the others too. If that really fundamentally changes anything, or if you still just say, well, that's nice, I'll do my due diligence and come to my own conclusions. And there are jurisdictional red credits in the market from the architecture for Red Plus transactions, just for the record.
Thanks for that reminder.
Great. I'll jump in. So certainly it's something we keep a very close eye on, right? ICVCM is incredibly important, and the push towards standardization across registries, across approaches, in any way, shape, or form is critical. I think for us, we're a procurement program that answers to a finance organization and a risk organization and a very large company. And so we have to have answers to any potential risk question that might come our way. We have to keep doing the diligence that we're doing at this point in the market. It's not to say that won't ever shift, but at this point, we are going to continue to do our deep due diligence process ourselves. So not only can we highlight the risks that we're coming across, but we can contract around them. That's what is really critical to us.
So what I'm hearing you say is that the risk to your company is so great that you will keep doing your own due diligence regardless of verification or ICVM, but it's particular to your reputational risk.
Reputational, and I would also say we recognize the position we have in the market, and we are in the fortunate position of being able to do that diligence, and to be able to get very deep in the specific nuances of each project. We think it's important not only that we do that for our risk exposure, it is for that, but also for the many buyers who do not have the teams that we have. How can we help further this market? And also for projects, how can we help projects understand our criteria better? That diligence process tends to actually help us get to shared understanding of what's critical. And not just from our own perspective. We work with third-party advisors who are deep in the space, and they've got incredibly important opinions, and not just opinions, but research that needs to be brought to the fore as well. And so how do we use the procurement program that we have to serve as a convening function for some of those really important topics?
Look for the Microsoft star. All right. We have gentleman over here. Why don't we go from the back forward, and then we'll move over to this side here.
Hello? Oh. Hi, my name is Lee. I'm CEO of Wovoka. We do nature restoration in the Philippines. My question is really for Microsoft and Ariel. You have a very clear model of what you need, right? So for removals in 2030 beyond for nature, you need to start getting those projects now. And I guess what we're experiencing is the cost of financing for the various earliest stages. The people that are willing to do it, it's quite high. So given you have that commitment, you know you need it, are you guys engaging early? Are you willing to take on the risks of feasibility studies, PDD, earlier engagement in the process?
I think it's a great question. I think our position is we're a procurement function. We think that the most catalytic role we have for not only our own internal stakeholders, but for the market is to really squarely cement ourselves as the creditworthy off-taker of choice for projects, right? That's one very important piece of the puzzle. It's not to say we won't entertain different constructs. We're very open. We want to know what projects need. That's why we are approaching this program in the way that we are, and kind of more the bespoke manner that we have to date. We want to understand where the need is, and if there are gaps, is it up to us to fill them? Maybe, maybe not. Is it up to us to help convene others who might be able to help us fill them? Maybe, maybe not, right? We're open to all different kind of permutations. I don't think it's fair to say we have a blanket position in one way or the other. So we're certainly open to hearing what the need is. And I think one of the things that we ask of folks engaging with us in that way is get into the specifics. What is the actual pain point? And how might we address that pain point? Kind of take it from a user story perspective. As a project developer in this part of the world, I need to do X, right? And then we can collectively team on how we as a team and as an ecosystem get there. But yeah, it's not, I'd say never, but never say always, right?
So we have one more question here, and then I think this gentleman over here had his hand raised.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for a great panel. Spencer Meyer from B0 Carbon. I'm hearing a lot of the language of risk up here on this panel. Thank you for that. And I think over time, over the last few years, there's been a lot of transition into this language of risk and less about did we pass the test, did we sort of get above or below the threshold or not, and more this continuum of risk. So I wanted to ask you each how that propagates, how that works in the work that you're doing. Ariel, you've talked a bit about this, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And to Chris's point, we're having a panel of the 3 ratings agencies that are here tomorrow at 11 o'clock. We're going to have us all on stage and dive into a lot of those questions you were raising. So thank you for raising that. And happy to discuss those more tomorrow.
Eric, do you want to take that at all?
I'll just give one example, Spencer. Permanence in forest projects has been a concern, right? Particularly anything in the western U.S., British Columbia, Alaska, where fire has been a big issue. So, I think about back to the California program. I think our thought was that we need a buffer pool to address the risk of reversal, and this was 2010. I forget, John, when that was. 2010-ish when we were meeting. 09, 7. Okay, yeah.
Well, and then there was the convening 3 years ago now for
Right.
proposed revisions, which my colleague was also part of.
Yeah. So the fire dynamic was very different in 2007 than it is in 2024. I don't think that risk was a huge factor in determining what the buffer pool was. I think that's essential going forward. I think ICVCM is going to require that if you want their tag, that your approach to dealing with the risk of reversal has to be risk-based in some way, and you have to justify that calculation. So I think that's one advance that this field could benefit from.
Well, one of the characteristics of the California buffer pool is it covers so many different types, so that you don't have, not only you have a diversity of forest types for forests, but you have every offset type. What are your thoughts about that kind of diversification of buffer pool set-asides?
Yeah, forest type and geography as well. I mean, I think to the extent that a program can cover a large area or have, examples coming from places that have different reversal risks that are not unrelated,
Yep.
Could be a way of mitigating some of the risk in the pool.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry,
Can
Christian,
I add
please.
on to that?
Please do.
I think one of the issues with that, with the reversal risk, is that, out in the West, I was talking with somebody this morning, a project developer, and, if you do fire risk reduction treatments, you may be decreasing your carbon stocks on the landscape, which you could end up with a reversal. But I think there's opportunity to design some of those incentives so that, we have more stable carbon in our stocks that are on site, rather than let's just increase the stocks as high as we can go for the most credits, but then we put ourselves at greater risk of wildfire impacts. So I think that's got to be a part of that risk matrix.
Yep.
If I may just.
Sure, and then
Yep.
we have a question over here. He's been waiting patiently. So could you make it short?
Of course.
Yeah.
To perhaps risk saying something ridiculously oversimplified, we recognize that every project has risk, and we contract around it, rather than saying, is this a risk-free project, and if so, I will purchase it. That's how our program kind of addresses that point.
Great approach.
Hi, it's Jamie Canton from Green Capital Limited. We've got a project in Peru, an IFM project in a remote part of the Peruvian Amazon. What I'd love to hear, because we're kind of jumping around at lots of different risks, and I don't have a priority on what's important and what's not. So could I suggest, I'd love to hear from all three or whomever wants to participate, the top three green lights that for a project really are, big driver, big opportunities, should be top of the stack that project developers, investors like us would want to know about it. And then 3 red lights in terms of, wow, we're not getting beyond these 3 no matter what, because that would be good to know what blows stuff up. So top 3 green lights, top 3 red lights.
I think we should really ask Christian to answer this one, and also recognize that a lot of the risk that we are talking about is consumer perception risk, and it may not just be perception. So there's risk for how you develop your project. There's also risk for how it is perceived. So,
Sure. Let me start with the red light, which is the opposite of the green light for me. Is that if a project doesn't incentivize actually changing any behavior on the ground, I think it's a huge red light. I think that's what the projects need to demonstrate. If your project can just be layered on business as usual, it's not really worth the extra money, the time. And I think that the opposite of that is the green light. The projects that actually show additionality, show permanence, and make a difference. So I know you asked for 3, but I think that a lot of those are really come down to the details. Are where are the revenues from the project going? Are they changing behavior? I think is really important.
there are 2 questions here. I think Misty in the back was the first.
Hi, Misty Schmidt with Conservation Partners. I'd like to know what any of you thinks about conservation easements and the role that they play in supporting the integrity of these projects.
And just for the audience, did everybody hear that? The question was, what role do conservation easements play in any of these projects in terms of enhancing integrity? Why don't I let the panel go, and then I'll perhaps jump in.
I mean, I think they're great. I only have experience with easements in the U.S. context, so I don't exactly know how they operate outside the U.S. I think it's a great indicator that when it's present, it's a great indicator that the landowner and that future landowners would abide by the agreements that were embedded in a carbon project. I don't think that they're absolutely essential. I think there's other surrogates that can provide some of the same benefits, but I don't know that there's anything stronger than a conservation easement in providing that certainty.
And there are, I believe at this point, 28 other countries that have an equivalent to a conservation easement. It's a perpetual agreement that runs with the land and guides how that land is managed and persists in its relatively natural state. Christian?
Yeah, I think it can add a layer to permanence, especially in a program that may only last 40 years or so, which is less than the rotation age of a stand in most parts of this country. So I think that if a project elects to participate in a shorter, commitment time frame and then add on a conservation easement, that's two things that can get to a longer term in terms of permanence. But oftentimes we don't see that happening that much right now, but I think it's definitely something that we'll see more in the future.
And for those who don't know, if there's a conservation easement with a carbon offset project, there's a reduction to the contribution to the buffer pool in recognition of that enhanced integrity and permanence. Ariel?
To keep it brief, I think it's a great tool. It's not the only tool that we would look at. And so again, project specific, but certainly a great tool to think about.
Great.
Thanks. Robert Maddox with N Value. First, Ariel, just thank you for what all Microsoft's doing. I mean, I think all of us feel that. And my question starts with you, but I'd like the panel to also chime in. There's 1,100 of us here, and you're the only buyer. So what do we do next year to get some more buyers in the room? At least just come to the room. I didn't say buy, but I mean, when people walk with their feet and they don't even show up. So I'd be curious to know your thoughts.
Well, first, thank you for your thanks. I feel grateful to be in the position, and it's not my doing that we have the program. I'm just lucky to kind of be a conduit for it. So thank you. I think, myself and Steph Harris, who's also in the audience here, we've not been around carbon markets nearly as long as some folks have, but we've been around long enough to know the quality of this conference and the quality of the conversations that happen here. I think this one tends to not be quite as much on the radar of folks in the buyer space, simply because the persona of a buyer tends to not be pure carbon removal, carbon markets focused. It tends to be a CSO or something like that who has a remit for renewables, and they have a remit for waste, and they have a remit for water, and their backgrounds may be carbon. Pretty unlikely given how nascent this is relative to some of those other, energy. The energy industry has been around a lot longer, right? So it's kind of an awareness thing, I think, in terms of this specific conference. There are other buyers here. I might just note. I won't call. Yeah, exactly. Isabel put her hand up, so I'm going to call her out over there from McKinsey. So go chat to her too. But I think in general that's a conference question. But I think like the broader question of buyers in the market, I think it needs to be a bit simpler to engage with than it has been to date, and the risk-reward profile for a sustainability kind of officer needs to be a bit different than it is today, right? So I'll leave it at that because I feel like I'm hogging the mic here, but
yeah, I'll add one thing is that as long as it's permitted by the developer, when we're in our verification phase of a project, I more than welcome a buyer to tag along on a site visit, ask us questions. We're there to provide assurance about the conformance of the project to the methodology, and it's a lot of, it's kind of fun to do that, have that educational aspect, and if you come out on a fun site visit, I think you would really enjoy. So, we're open to that as long as, the developer is.
I'm going to put another question to our panel. So in other fields that are somewhat similar, pollution trading credits, or when people are seeking to differentiate their product in a consumer market, you've had the government step in. SOX, NOx, on the one side, on the regulatory side, or for example, in the energy efficiency space, things like Energy Star. So that's been your blessing of approval. What do you all think about that within this space? Is there a role there for, as the markets mature, is there a role there that you perceive would be constructive? So why don't we start in the opposite order so that Ariel gets the final word?
That's a tough one. And just, for background, most of my work is in the U.S., so I think about this first from the U.S. perspective. And I guess I don't think the political dynamics are right in the U.S., for the government to be a trusted broker. I just think it's too polarized. So like Energy Star was a great program, but it was 30 or something years old. I don't know that would work today, so it doesn't feel right. It feels to me like, these other sort of civic sector efforts that really set the bar, like I keep saying that, but something like ICVCM, that helps set a bar, and that then gets recognized by the marketplace, and that the market, this might be a little bit Pollyannish, but the market starts to recognize the highest integrity, and that really drives a theory of change where high integrity becomes the most valuable. Just a guess, but that feels to me like a higher probability solution than the federal government stepping in or state governments.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Eric on that point. I think that, at least from my experience with forestry projects are so complex and take such a high level of technical expertise to understand to begin with, that it would potentially muddy the waters in terms of having a governmental entity step in. I think if we want something like a rating, then we should just increase the standards and then have those met, rather than more intervention and another step in the process. Since we're already, in the compliance market, we have a verification phase, a registry phase, and then an air resources board phase. So to have another one on top of that, it already takes so long, and there's so much uncertainty. I think that it would be detrimental at this point.
I'll say my own personal opinion here, certainly not speaking on behalf of Microsoft on this one, but I think, would it be great if we had more policy measures in place in just short order to manage this? Certainly. I mean, anything that we could get to catalyze the market, to catalyze, more importantly, the solutions that we're incentivizing would be incredible. I think it's important to recognize the time scale that we're dealing with and just the urgency of the crisis, and ask ourselves whether that's the fastest path or if there are faster paths, right? And I think that's where private industry, the finance sector in particular, you can move really quickly if there's money to be made, candidly, from the finance sector, right? And so how do we balance what we'd like to see happen with the fastest path, so that we're 2030's close, 2050's close. We don't have all that much time to actually figure this out. So how do we balance what we'd like to see with the speed we need to see that change occur?
So while I agree with every sentiment that you just said, could you clarify where that falls down relative to, on a personal basis, am I hearing you say that if there were a policy measure in place that gave that kind of relative certainty, that would speed things up or not?
Just don't think I could make a blanket statement broadly, right? Like, I think
that's fine.
There could be ways it speeds it up, depends on what the policy is. There could be ways it slows it down, right? It all comes down to what it is and how it's implemented. And I think that's really where I see that process of figuring that out, of what it is and how it's implemented, being a rather long process that we may or may not have time for.
Got it. That's a very helpful. We have time for a couple more questions. We have the gentleman in the green shirt. Let's do up front.
Yeah, thanks. John Kennedy from Down to Earth Carbon. I'd be interested to have your thoughts on integrity from a disenfranchised indigenous and smallholder communities in the southern, mainly in the southern world, but it could also apply to indigenous communities here in North America. I was just wondering, like, particularly in regards, maybe Christian, in regards to training, or even Ariel, in regards to your ability to identify risk and threats to like unintended, or even sometimes intended impacts of projects.
Christian, you want to go first?
Can you repeat the end of that tail end of that question?
Yeah, I did. Well, in regards to you, it would, as far as TubeSud goes, from a verifier, the level of sensitivity training that you have, or would be required to have to be certified to identify some unintended consequences from projects because there wasn't a sufficient level of engagement or recognition of inequities between in communities or within communities, and how that could be addressed in your, like how you get trained up to be able to identify those.
Right. Yeah. Right now, we don't currently have an established training program or regiment that would address that concern specifically. We have been involved in the past in a number of indigenous community projects. Just based on experience, I mean, my first carbon project experience was with the White Mountain Apache tribe almost 12 years ago. And it really showed me the potential impact that carbon projects can have for tribes, not only from a climate benefit perspective, but in terms of providing a revenue source to have tribal members more involved in the management of their natural resources. On that project specifically, there was, what I was told was money was being spent sending students to forestry school and doing more management on the ground with tribal members. So I think that specifically we don't have a training regimen, but I think that through our experience that we've seen a lot of positive impact and are sensitive to those issues.
I'm going to suggest we take one more question.
Can I just add to that, Laurie? I just wanted to go back to this gentleman's question. To me, a red light, if you're not addressing the indigenous issues, particularly in the tropics, it's a huge red light. It would take all day to describe kind of what's needed, but, you know, direct involvement of indigenous communities in the development of standards, reviewing of projects at every stage is really critical. So I think that's something that could scuttle projects, particularly in the tropics.
Stuart Bewley with Carbon Storage Solutions. Can you address the issue of permanence? Some carbon projects, like the ARB projects, require storage for 100 years. Some projects, I understand, in the voluntary market only require storage of the carbon for 40 years. That's a huge difference.
Yes, that difference between the rolling 100-year standard for ARB, the ton is going to be sequestered across that forest for at least 100 years, and it rolls every year forward for every new credit versus a 40-year standard. That's one of the critical questions to my mind of the equivalency. When is a ton is a ton is a ton? So I would be grateful for our panel's responses about how you see that being addressed.
I do not have the secret answer to that question. It's really tricky. But I would say that my thinking has changed a little bit over the last 12 or 15 years. Like the crisis is now, and we need climate action yesterday. And I think we need to be creating systems that encourage higher levels of participation and having multiple points of entry so that, you know, regardless, you know, different types of landowners or land managers can participate in natural climate solutions is essential. So, like the change for me has been, you know, I was, I guess, part of the endorsement of 100 years. I think it's a great standard. I think it needs to be available and recognized in the marketplace for what it is. But I also think that there should be other points of entry that are, you know, potentially discounted, you know, based, but they're vital because we need action. You know, like I said, we need it now.
And that's the question of equivalency. How would you do that discounting? That is one of the ratings questions or the other kinds of questions. Is it a linear discount? What do you do with that? And because the other side of the coin is a deep, deep concern that then that would lead to intentional release right at the peak of the problem, right, as we're beginning to see it. So there's a terrific dissonance between those two things, and discounting is one way to approach it. So this goes to the point that I was trying to lead you on about, Ariel, earlier, from the point of view of anybody who plays in the currency market. There is an equivalency that you can work with. Weights and measures across the world are very, very different. UN has an equivalency system that you can do that. It has not diminished the diversity of approaches, but it has created a real crosswalk so that people know when is a ton is a ton is a ton. And so with that note, we are at the end of our time. I think that members of the panel here are willing to stay up for any questions, but I'd appreciate it if you join me in thanking them for being part of this.